All right, to wrap up this entire chapter, there's a system of locks, river locks, similar to the Panama Canal. They're pretty old, and they're in the Tennessee River. And they're so old that they often cause delays in the waterway's barge shipments. And thousands of hours of delays in river traffic every year reduce the productivity of the river transport system. And this contributes to a reduction in U.S. economic growth. So maybe it's time to update those river locks. And just to look finally at some issues and applications, the implications of U.S. secular stagnation for real GDP and the price level, thinking about these things. So recall, again, secular stagnation is basically the idea that we have low economic growth for a long period of time, which is kind of what we've had in the past decade or so since the Great Recession. So what are the implications of this slow, snail-like growth? What are the implications for real GDP and the price level? So as we'll see on the next slide, in the absence of secular stagnation, the long-run aggregate supply curve would have shifted from LRAS1 to LRAS2, and the aggregate demand curve would have shifted from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2. So I'll just show you those real quick. Right, so this is going from 1 to 2 is what we would have seen. But secular stagnation resulted in a smaller rightward shift, so shifting to long-run aggregate supply 3 and aggregate demand 3 rather than 2. And so what are the results of that in terms of real GDP and the price level? Well, as we can see, it means that real GDP is lower. So rather than being $18 trillion per year, real GDP has been less than that at roughly $17.1 trillion per year. And on top of that, we've seen reduced inflation. So this is exactly what we've seen over the last 10 years. We've seen sort of stagnant economic growth, sort of slower than usual economic growth, and at the same time, relatively low inflation compared to the rest of the United States economic history, where we've typically seen between 2 and 3% inflation. We see less than 1% inflation in the last decade or so. So we can use our model to basically show us that, right? So that's what we see here. All right, that was chapter 10 on long-run aggregate supply and the price level. So just to recap, we talked about what long-run aggregate supply is and how we model economic growth using long-run aggregate supply. We saw that it's a vertical line, so real output, real GDP in the long run does not depend on the price level. It's independent of the price level, so that's why it's a vertical line. And this is because firms have full information. They've fully adjusted to all the possible shocks in the economy, so there's no incentive to produce more or less given a change in the price level. And we also saw that economic growth is a shift to the right? Then in the second section, we talked about aggregate demand and why it slopes downward and the reasons for that. So recall the real balances effect, the interest rate effect, and the what was the last one called? The international trade effect. So those are the three reasons why it slopes downward. And then we also talked about what are the non-price level things that can shift aggregate demand. Then we brought the two pieces together and saw what constitutes a long-run equilibrium for the economy as a whole, and explain why economic growth can cause deflation, which we refer to as secular deflation. So again, long-run equilibrium is just where it's the price level where real planned expenditures equal real GDP or real planned production in the economy. And so if aggregate demand is stationary, it doesn't change, and we have some economic growth, then that leads to a decrease in the price level, again, which we call secular deflation. And then we wrapped up the chapter by looking at what are the probable reasons for persistent inflation that we've seen over the last 50 or 60 years or so. And we basically came to the conclusion that for the most part, it must be demand side inflation, right? Because we see economic growth, so we know that for the most part, long run aggregate supply is shifting to the right. And then if that's happening, the only way to get inflation is for aggregate demand to also shift to the right, but by an amount more than long run aggregate supply. But there is a possibility for us to have supply side inflation as well, which happens when the long run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, assuming aggregate demand stays the same. But for the most part, we must be experiencing demand side inflation. Okay, that wraps up chapter 10. Thanks for watching. Oh yeah, for your discussion post, I want you to post what you think has happened in recent months to aggregate demand and or aggregate supply. I think that would be a really good discussion for you to have. So post in the discussion post for this lecture Thursday, April 16th, before midnight, what you think has happened in recent months to aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply, and try to justify it with what you've learned in this chapter. All right, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next lecture video. And don't forget, you can email me if you have any questions or concerns about anything, okay? Thanks.